I've always loved this image. It showed up in some ecclesiastical resource a number of years ago. It's called intercession. I don't know. I just think it's a chalice. And we know that we all bring very different sets of eyes to a chalice, don't we? And we know as well that a chalice is a symbol for a womb. So it's a place where life is or life isn't. From it we get that expression, cup half full, half empty. We're all old enough to know that it's what we see that actually is. We understand the magic of our ability to see. We remember when we thought the cup was half empty, when in retrospect, it was full beyond our imaginings. And then we also remember when the cup was full. In retrospect, there wasn't much in it. You understand that, don't you? You understand that we have the power to tell the story. So this is a season when we remember our story. First passage is from the book of Isaiah, speaking to a time when the community of Israel was experiencing a great deal of barrenness. They were living in exile, and a word came to them for the purpose of enabling them to see life where they thought there was none. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And now an excerpt from the first chapter of the book of Luke. We read last week, and I'll say more about it later, from Matthew's development of the mythology around the birth of Jesus. This is now an excerpt of Luke's development of the mythology, the story, the theology around the birth of Jesus. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. Both he and his wife Elizabeth were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to the commandments and regulations of the Lord, but they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren and both were getting on in years. Once, when he was serving as priest before God, there appeared to him an angel of the Lord. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. He will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God." But Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondered at his delay in the sanctuary. When he did come out, he could not speak to them. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me, when he looked favorably upon me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." So who knew there was so much stuff about sex in the Bible? Our theological and then culturally puritanical ancestors made sure that when we looked at Scripture, we looked at it through a very particular lens that kept the subject of sex far from the sacred places. Unless, of course, it was to point out how bad it was, especially for women. And so you will recall last Sunday that I shared with you the stories of 4 women found in the genealogy of Jesus as it is recorded in the first chapter of Matthew. Bishop John Spong refers to these women as the shady ladies. Do you remember them? They are memorable. It's a great opening theological line at a dinner party. Let me tell you about Tamar, who had to seduce her father-in-law by pretending to be a prostitute so that she could bear a child and be reclaimed by his household. Let me tell you about Rahab the prostitute and the foreigner who colluded with the Israelites to save her people and theirs. Or Ruth, who hid under the blanket of Boaz so as to seduce him into marriage. And then Bathsheba, she's a little bit more famous, first impregnated by David, who then had her husband murdered in order to cover his tracks. Just in case you thought that your family tree was a little bit shady, you have nothing on Jesus. And while this tradition of ours has done some weird and abusive things around sex, I know that some of you are still cringing when I say the word, I'm still cringing. There was a deep conviction that sex or the bearing of a child was redemptive, was economic security, was old age security, was free labor. But most of all, was deeply honorable and God's greatest blessing. And the other side of the coin, barrenness, was considered shameful and God's greatest curse. And so we have 3 major movements within theological history that include the story of a barren woman. It is always the woman's fault in this story. The founding couple of the nation of Israel, I know, I'm just going over the old story. I'll get there. I'll get where we're going. But this is really important. Abraham and Sarai, childless in their 70s, when God calls them to begin a new story, which, by the way, if you're over 70, that's a really important part of our tradition. And then in their 90s, an angel tells Sarah that she's going to have a baby. Now, keep in mind, this is myth, right? This is meant to carry more than a tantalizing tale. But then let's look at the next barren woman, Hannah, mother of Samuel, the first major prophet of Israel, the prophet who arises to accompany the birth of the monarchy launched by Saul, followed by David. Samuel, the one where the people of Israel went, we want a king so we can be like every other nation. God says, fine, but then you're going to need a prophet to hold your kings to account. So Samuel, known as the one to speak truth to power, known as the kingmaker. And then fast forward, we have Elizabeth, wife of Zechariah, a priest in the temple. So let's take a moment to look at Hannah and Elizabeth. Hannah, barren. Some of you know what that means. All of you know what that means. Empty. Until the birth of Samuel, the one anointed by God to accompany the first kings of Israel. Luke then draws on the same theme to create the birth story of John the Baptist, wanting to reinforce his identity as a prophet in the lineage of the prophets of Israel, and at the same time, he reinforces for him the identity of Jesus. Because John, in the tradition of Samuel, same birth story, is also a kingmaker. He anoints Jesus while baptizing Jesus. So it may or may not matter to you, but the birth stories of Matthew and Luke have created around Jesus, which are not mentioned anywhere else, by the way, are not history, but mythology and theology. In the ancient world, it is the mythology that carries the theology. And we do those stories much disservice to simply say they just happened. So, there is the history of the theology and the mythology that brings us to this point, which is our starting point. Barrenness. Emptiness. It's bigger than sex in our tradition. It's mythic. It's emptiness, it's dryness, it's desert, it's despair, it's labor pains without giving birth. And depending on the glasses you are wearing, it is either the end of a story or it is the setting of a new story. Barrenness. It's bigger than babies. All of this stuff is bigger than babies. Let us not reduce this season to a baby. The mythology of barrenness, particularly as it is articulated in these stories around Sarah and Hannah and Elizabeth, is an invitation. It is an invitation for the people of the sacred story to consider the impossible. Barrenness is an invitation of the people of the sacred story to consider the impossible. Old women do not have children. We know that. They knew that. Which is why Sarah laughed. She laughed at the idea of the impossible. And Zechariah, a priest, a faithful servant in the temple, a liturgist within the tradition, he responds with skepticism and disbelief. Laughter, skepticism. Which one are you? When you are invited to imagine the impossible, do you, no? Or do you furrow your brows and ask for the evidence? Our tradition suggests that barrenness does not need to be the end of the story. In fact, barrenness, emptiness, might just be creating the condition for a new story. The biggest question, then, is whether or not we want one. Whether or not we want a new story. So here are a few examples of how this theme is present in our world today. I'll tell a couple of personal ones, and then we're going to go global. We often create barrenness in people. We often create no stories or end stories for people because of the stories we impose on them. I have a friend in her mid-40s who came to Picton for a job a few years ago, and one of the reasons she loves living here is really interesting. It's not the beach. She loves living here because in the 5 years in which she's lived here, not once has she been asked, "So, why aren't you married with children?" Those expectations we have of people to A, meet the right person, B, get married, C, you haven't got kids yet? Where are the kids? That story imposes an emptiness and a sense of failure on those who do not live up to that script. We need to be careful not to impose stories on others that they cannot live up to. When we do that, we curse them with barrenness and condemn them to failure. I have another friend who lost his job unfairly. A few years back, it was wrong. But 5 years later, he is still stuck in that story. 5 years later, the only story that he can tell is how he was wronged. It now defines him, and it has left him barren. It's hard to let go of those stories and patterns that contribute to our barrenness. We know that. But old stories like that are never fertile ground. Sometimes the potential for new life involves letting go of everything that used to define who we were. I know we don't want to hear that. But that's certainly part of the aging process, isn't it? It involves, while we lose our health and our strength and some of our abilities, imagining that there is a new way of living in the world. And we know those people, don't we, who as they age, continue to age with curiosity and creativity and courage. They don't just dry up. So there's the second thought about barrenness. Here's the third. In an age of materialism, where it is probably true that in our lifetime, most of us in the room have probably owned more stuff than all of the accumulated possessions of the 3 generations before us. Would you say that's true? Just want to sit with that and get totally depressed for a moment? And so for those of us who own more stuff than the 3 generations previous to us, the thought of emptiness is completely contrary to our understanding of success. Yet our tradition insists that there are times when emptiness, barrenness, letting go is a necessary spiritual condition for renewal. And so it's important to learn to live with emptiness, to be patient with it, to trust it as a place of fertility. If you would like to have practice in being patient with emptiness, I invite you to join the meditation group on Tuesday morning. Because I know that those who practice meditation, as well as all of the great mystics of our tradition, will affirm that in our emptiness, we are in fact most fertile. So those are 3 very personal stories. Now we're going to go big. We will be praying this morning, joining thousands, tens of thousands of people around the world who are praying for the people at Standing Rock, a place where Indigenous people from around the world have gathered in peaceful protest of a pipeline going through land they consider to be sacred. But it's more than that. They are gathering there as well on behalf of a river from which they and thousands of others get their drinking water. So in a very short time, I'm going to say some big things, recognizing that there's no way I can get to all of the complexity. So I'll try and cut right to the chase. We know, though we really don't want to know, that the majority of military activity in the world today is rooted in the need to control natural resources, and more specifically, particularly in the Middle East, the need to control access to oil reserves. So let us say that and remember it even as we light the candle of peace. We know that the majority of natural resources fuel our lifestyle, whether it is fossil fuels or the kind of mineral required to power our cell phones. We know this. And we are being warned, and have been for some time, about how this story of consumption and rape of the planet is affecting not just the planet, but the lives of millions of people who are victims of the military violence, victims of the climate change, and victims of the economic system that sustains this story. The Standing Rock event is meant to represent an alternative story, and it is, I think, deeply rooted in our sacred story, a story that invites us to protect life, which is why we pray for peace and work for peace and light candles for peace. And if you haven't even heard of Standing Rock, then that speaks volumes about the power of the story of consumption that presently dominates the planet, and is quite happy for you not to hear an alternative story. For the story of consumption depends on our not embracing a new story. It also depends, and this may be even more important, on our not even being able to imagine that a new story is possible. The new story insists that water is more important than oil. The new story insists that we can protect the earth, live together peacefully, and have what we need. Not enough to compare to the 3 generations before us, while still respecting one another. The new story insists that there are other ways of fueling our lifestyle. Yet we have lived with a different set of glasses for so long. It's like Zechariah in the temple, right? Oh, give me a break. A child would have been amazing. It would have been grand, but you know what? It wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. And we have made do, and we are just set in this kind of sad, going nowhere story. And so even when what he longed for more than anything else shows up in front of his face, he cannot embrace it. I think Standing Rock is what we long for more than anything else. A group of people attached to the land, committed to nonviolence, standing up and saying, someone has got to say no here. Because God knows the rest of us haven't done a very good job of saying no. So I think those gathered at Standing Rock may very well be our Gabriel, reminding us that a new story is possible. This season of Advent in our tradition insists that the mystery we call God shows up in the flesh, our flesh, to teach us a new way of being together. That new way will look like hope and peace and joy and love, and it will look like what we long for the most, even as we try and find another space in our house or in our basement or in our storage unit for our stuff. This season reminds us that the possibilities for the impossible reside within us. Thank you to the community at Standing Rock, who has remembered that the possibilities for the impossible reside within us. Are we prepared to be the birthplace of the impossible? Sarah laughed. Zechariah said, love to, man, but I just don't see the evidence. Can we say, come hope, come peace, come justice, whatever it takes, come and be born in us today?